thank you for coming today to this lunchtime webinar on trade and health through a feminist lens, and also to the launch of our briefing on trade and health written by Dr. Silke Trommer. Just before they introduce the panelists, I just want to say that we're starting now, we're going to finish at 2 o'clock rather than 2:30, because we think that actually an hour is a better time for a webinar, particularly at lunchtime. For those of you who don't know, my name is Mary Ann Stevenson. I'm the director of the Women's Budget Group. We're an independent not-for-profit network that analyses the impact of economic policy on women and men and proposes alternatives that would promote gender equality. And at a time when trade deals are particularly pertinent in UK politics, I'm really delighted that we're going to be launching our briefing on trade and health, written by Dr. Silke Trommer. And she's going to introduce the paper and talk about the way in which trade deals have an impact on health and the way in which that impact is gendered, and particularly discussing the UK-Japan, UK-Australia and UK-New Zealand free trade agreements, how they're going to affect health systems, food and nutrition, and all the systems of daily life which we know have a different impact on women and men. Silke is from the University of Manchester and works on international political economy, global trade, development and social movements. We're also joined by Dr. Sophie Harman from Queen Mary University of London, who's a leading expert on health governance, feminist health research and the political economy of health, and she'll follow Silke to talk more about trade and gender. And then to bring a political and policy perspective of this, I'm delighted that we're also been joined by Anum Qaisar MP, the SNP's Deputy International Trade Spokesperson, and I know that the SNP are working on trade policy for Scotland at the moment, so I'm sure she and her team will be making notes. So our fantastic panel are going to present in that order, and then there will be time for questions at the end. If you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll try to get through as many of those as possible before we close at 2. So it's now my great pleasure to pass over to Silke, who's going to introduce her paper. Silke.
Thank you very much. First, I'm going to try and share my screen. How does that look for everyone?
That looks good.
Yes, thumbs up. Okay, perfect. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my briefing that I wrote for the Women's Budget Group, which examines the trade and health nexus in the UK's FTA strategy through a gender lens. Today, I will first explain why the trade and health nexus to me is a gender issue. I will then kind of take a look at standard commitments in trade agreements and the trade and health nexus and what the relationship is between these two things. I will also take you through very briefly the latest UK trade policy initiatives, some of which I've analysed in my briefings and some of which are unfolding at the moment. And then I will go into a little bit more detail about two particular issues that I thought would be on everyone's lips at the moment. So one is trade and goods liberalizations and the links into food and nutrition, and the other one is trade and services liberalization and the NHS. And I will close with some policy recommendations. So the trade and health nexus, generally speaking, has economic, political and legal dimensions. In economic terms, we can consider how global flows of products, services, investments, and technology can support public health, but also how trade shocks can increase socioeconomic inequalities, which tend to have negative repercussions for public health. In political and legal terms, we can consider how international legal obligations in trade agreements shape the regulatory environment for public health policies. Now, within academia, the trade and health nexus is predominantly studied within the disciplines of public health and international law, and to a lesser extent, international political economy, which is my field. And to my knowledge, it is hardly ever studied through a feminist lens. I want to argue today, and I argue in my briefing, that this is a gap, because the trade and health nexus is and should be understood as a core feminist issue. To make this point, I rely on the theoretical concept of social reproduction, which generally refers to care work for children, the sick and the elderly, and for household-based and domestic work. Social reproductive labor is typically unpaid or underpaid, and social norms typically ascribe it to women. when carried out domestically, social reproductive labor is not typically considered to be part of the economy. So another way of saying this is to say that social reproductive labor isn't typically thought to be economic in nature, but rather something that happens in the so-called private sphere. And for me, what feminist political economy brings to the debate on trade and health is to say that we typically have too narrow an understanding of the economy when we analyze the links between trade and health. We typically think of things like, for example, how do FTAs affect the conditions under which medical products are produced and brought to market? And while that is important, we need to get a fuller picture of the trade and health nexus. So feminist political economy tells us that we must also consider how FTAs affect the realm of social reproduction. That is to say, what happens when someone who cares for a relative at home, for example, is trying to acquire that particular product. One way in which feminist political economists have provided this bigger picture, and I draw on this in the briefing, is to isolate particular types of economies that sit across the realm of the productive economy and the realm of social reproduction, and to study them holistically. In the briefing, I consider the care economy on the one hand and the food economy on the other hand. Now, from the academic literatures in public health and in international law that I previously mentioned, we know a lot about how standard commitments in trade agreements relate to care economies and food economies more broadly. And if you're looking for an entry point into these literatures, there are some useful readings listed at the back of the briefing that I would draw your attention to. In the briefing itself, I provide this box which tries to summarize this for different types of standard commitments that we typically find in a trade agreement. And the various sections of the briefing also explain these mechanisms in detail, and importantly also set out the intersections between them. However, I don't have the time in the next 10 minutes to take you through all of this. So I've decided to focus on two issues that are hot topics in the public debate at the moment. But I am happy to answer questions on any of the aspects that are listed here in the Q&A, and please do enter your questions into the chat. So in what follows, I will take a look at the links between trade liberalization in goods and food and nutrition, and also trade liberalization in services and health systems in 3 new UK FTAs. So as Marianne has already said, I consider the UK-Japan deal, which has been signed and has entered into force in 2021. And I also consider UK-Australia and UK-New Zealand. Both of these agreements have been signed and are both currently undergoing ratification. Let me just say quickly something about my intention with the briefing. I think when it comes to these 3 agreements that I analysed, we can all agree that they are done. UK, Australia, and New Zealand are likely going to be ratified potentially very, very soon. However, I felt that if we can take a feminist lens to the health-related provisions in these agreements, it can then allow us to understand what questions to ask and what to look for in the ongoing negotiations that the UK is engaging in with some very, very crucial trading partners. And you see the list here. The US is obviously the most significant, but many of the others are significant also. So this is the intention. We work off the existing deals, but it's a broader picture. We try and understand how do we need to scrutinize ongoing negotiations if we want to see positive impacts on trade and health from a feminist lens. So jumping straight into trade and goods liberalization and food environments, it's important to understand that there is actually a complex relationship between goods liberalization and food environments that concerns the availability, affordability, and nutritional value of food, but also the shape and nature of food markets. So this encompasses not only the types of products that come to the table, but also food producers themselves. While trade liberalization tends to reduce consumer costs, which is of course a good thing, it has been shown in several studies that it can benefit the wrong types of food producers from a public health perspective. So it can benefit those food producers that sell highly processed or otherwise unhealthy foods. And even worse, actually, the cost advantage gained by these types of producers can crowd out local and small scale food producers from the market, which are the ones that tend to produce the more healthy foods. So while overall food costs may decrease, there can be an associated health cost resulting from a shift in diet towards more unhealthy foods. And this is a feminist issue, not only because women are predominantly responsible for household provisioning in food, but also because they are disproportionately represented among households with limited spending power. And if you think of the market, the food environment, and nationally adjusting to a situation where it's the more unhealthy foods that become kind of more affordable, you can understand why the health cost that is associated with that is more relevant to the households holding less spending power. So it means that the question that we need to ask when we look at FTA negotiations is, how do FTAs structure food markets, and what types of foods become available and affordable under the liberalization that is being carried out or that is being proposed? So I brought a list of all the agricultural products that are being liberalized in the 3 existing deals, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. I kind of wrote them all together here. In the briefing, you can get an individual list, which is in which agreement. But I think if you just glance over what you see here, you don't have to be a public health expert to say that you will be worried about most of these things. Maybe not the apples, and I don't know the rice, Sophie, you will tell us. But from a public health perspective, this isn't the list that we would like to see of products that are being liberalized. Now, these 3 agreements are unlikely to significantly affect the UK food environment, simply because the trade volumes aren't large enough of these products coming from these countries. But this is precisely why it's important to begin analysing these questions now, and then taking them forward to negotiations that are ongoing. Because of course, if this approach is taken also in negotiations with the US, Canada, Mercosur, and these types of countries, there may very well be an impact. And it might be kind of worthwhile thinking through the FTA strategy then also in relationship to the government's obesity strategy, actually, and what are the tensions and how can we resolve them. In addition, UK, Japan has another quite unusual feature. It contains a standalone chapter that commits governments to promoting trade in agriculture, exchanging information on sustainable agriculture, cooperating on technology, and improving what is called the business environment for food and agricultural producers. And from a health and social reproductive standpoint, a key concern is that such cooperation will consolidate the market power of large food and agricultural corporations, while those unable to afford healthy food choices will disproportionately pay the associated health costs. So this is the food thing I wanted to talk about. Then I'm going to very swiftly move on to services. I really wanted to talk about services liberalization and the NHS in particular, because when I follow the public debate on this, I note that the various positions typically don't reflect adequately how trade liberalization actually works. And I feel it would be beneficial for everybody to get a clear picture and again, know exactly where to look in the agreement and what types of questions to ask. So let me tell you a little bit about how service liberalization works, and apologies to those in the audience who already know. Service liberalization works by service sector and mode of delivery. So what we need to ask is, how are all the service sectors implied in the day-to-day running of the NHS, social care, and other types of care regulated under the agreement? So just to be blunt, the agreement will never say the health system is herewith liberalized. It will never say that, but it may very well liberalize all service sectors that are implicated in the running of the health system across all modes of delivery. Modes of delivery generally refers to whether the service is crossing the border, which typically happens online, whether the service provider is crossing the border, which can be either a corporate health and care provider or a health and care worker, or whether the consumer is crossing the border, which refers typically to treatment abroad. Now, any trade agreement will liberalize services in one of 2 ways. Either governments list all of the service sectors and all of the modes of delivery that they want to liberalize, and that is called positive list approach, and it's what is used at the WTO. Or instead, they will list the sectors and the modes of delivery that they want to exclude. And that means that any sector and mode of delivery that is not explicitly mentioned is fully liberalized. This is referred to as the negative list approach. Liberalisation commitments do not preclude the service from being delivered as a public service, but it does introduce the element of competition from private economic operators who have given the right to market access. It's also important to consider that there are usually always so-called general exception clauses to liberalisation commitments in trade agreements, and they do generally allow governments to take measures in the interest of broader public policy goals, although this usually comes with certain conditions, and I'm going to come back to that point. So as feminists, again, we need to care about this, not only because women are primary users of public services and are disproportionately employed in the health system, but also, as we've seen in the COVID-19 pandemic, when the health system reaches its limits, care work is pushed into the households, the domestic settings, and there it is then picked up by women. So the question we need to ask when we look at trade agreements and trade negotiations is, how do service liberalisation commitments taken in the FTA affect the day-to-day running of the NHS, social care, and then what are the knock-on effects for domestic care setting? So again, I've kind of lumped everything that's in the 3 UK deals together. For a clearer picture, please turn to the briefing. But the couple of key insights that I want to share before I finish is the UK subscribes to a negative list approach from what we can tell, and it makes explicit that the agreements include commitments that apply not only to central government, but also regional government, local government, and non-governmental bodies acting in the exercise or exercising authority on behalf of a governing body. So what this implies is that actors like councils, etc., they are included in the agreement, they're covered. In terms of exclusions, there's quite an interesting picture in that we generally see things excluded like professional services, research and development, business services, communication, transport, energy, etc. UK New Zealand stands out because it actually explicitly excludes health-related professional services and retail of pharmaceuticals, and also health and social services. However, in all of these exclusions, the nature of the exclusion itself refers to maintaining professional qualification requirements and domestic regulations in the sector. It does not exclude the sector fully from liberalisation. It just makes sure that these types of regulatory standards can be maintained. I'm going to skip the ratchet clauses in the interest of time. We can talk about it if you're interested. I just want to say something about the general exceptions. So all 3 FTAs, and this is really standard for all FTAs, contain a general exception clause on service trade liberalisation. That clause mirrors very closely the wording that is in the WTO provision on general exceptions to service liberalisation. And from that scholarship, this is now from international legal scholarship, we know that the way in which the wording has been interpreted within the WTO has made it quite difficult for governments to justify any measures that they have taken within a broader public policy goal like health that has at the same time undermined the service liberalisation commitment. And there are really 2 kind of aspects of the wording that are problematic typically. And again, unfortunately, all of these are replicated in the UK deals, is that usually we find the kinds of provisions that, or the kinds of wording that has been interpreted to mean that a government, if it takes a measure in the interest of health as the public policy goal, it needs to take the least trade restrictive measure possible. It can't be any measure that allows to meet the policy goal. It has to be the measure with the least trade restrictive impact. And this is sort of difficult in terms of legal certainty because it goes into the arena of would and could and should, and that's always very difficult to argue for a lawyer. And then also there is a problem in that the provisions state that any measure needs to be necessary for maintaining public health, which is a higher legal standard than saying it needs to be related to, because the government then needs to prove that without this measure being taken, the general policy goal of public health wouldn't have been met. Whereas if the wording said it's related to public health, it's an easier standard to show that there is a link. So I won't go overly into my policy recommendations. There's a really long list at the end of the briefing as well. I just want to say that actually there is a lot that we can bring to the policy debate in terms of small tweaks, like changing certain words in certain agreements, or also broader propositions, bolder propositions. But generally, I do personally think that it would be really important from this kind of feminist, political economy, public health perspective that I've tried to put forward, that we apply gender-based and health-based impact assessment and monitoring of the deals, and also provide for remedies where there are negative impacts that become apparent after the deal has been implemented. And to really gain the full picture, we need to include a wide range of civil society actors in trade policy decision making, including those representing public health, food safety, food security, and gender equality concerns. So I leave it here, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that, Silke. That was incredibly comprehensive to get through in 20 minutes. Really, really useful. And I've got lots of questions, even if nobody else has. So anyway, I'm now going to hand over to Sophie Harman, who is going to respond to the paper and say a bit more about Feminist, the sort of health impacts.
Thanks, Marianne, and thanks, Silke. Firstly, just congratulations to Silke and the Women's Budget Group on this real essential briefing on the impacts of trade on women's health. I think trade policy is often deliberately quite opaque and secretive. So this briefing is really essential and is a real guide to anyone who's new to trade policy, feminist political economy, and that link between trade and health. It kind of just tells you exactly what you need to know, which is, I know what a briefing should do, but often it doesn't. So just to congratulations for both of you. And also everyone needs to know it. So not only does it tell you what you need to know, we do need to know this stuff. So as Silke discussed, there's a lot of detail on all aspects of trade policy in the briefing. And what I want to do is just pull out some of the kind of 3 takeaways that I think are really essential for understanding this relationship between trade and women's health, and then what we should be doing about this. So the 3 things I want to kind of focus on is, firstly, the NHS is female. Secondly, intellectual property has always been a feminist issue. And thirdly, food is life and death, which sounds actually quite dramatic. You know, when you write something and then you read it out loud, that's quite grand, but it's life and death. So let's just start with the first point. The NHS is female. Concerns about trade policy in the UK predominantly always centre on Brexit and the NHS, or just the NHS. So it seems like a good place to start. And I don't want to go over this in too much detail because I think Silke did a really good job of this. But really, let's just reiterate the point that any trade deals, so notably these FTAs that focus on the service sector, are going to affect NHS service provision. Those people who do this service provision are women, from everyday nursing, cleaning, catering, microbiologists, doctors, you name it. As 77% of the NHS workforce, we can tell that this is a feminised issue from the off. So if anything, this justifies why we're looking at it. These kind of deals are going to impact on the employment and the labour of women, particularly in the health service. And this is not just an issue within the UK. I think what's really important is how we look at how this impacts upon a feminised workforce around the world, particularly as part of the wider phenomenon of the brain drain. So having health professionals that travel from low-income countries to middle-income countries, middle-income countries to high-income countries for work. And whilst there are these kind of exclusion measures within these deals, as Silke rightly points out, the devil is in the detail. They're not excluding the movement of labour, they're excluding certain standards, so that maintaining certain standards within that. So while these trade deals don't necessarily create these problems, we know that the brain drain has existed for a really long time, it could definitely exacerbate them. And this is important because we've got to also make sure that trade policy is also aligning to wider international development policy and the strength of health systems around the world. As feminists, I think we're interested in trade because of these inequalities, but the knock-on impact these inequalities have on international development, poverty and inequality throughout the world. And this theme of kind of global solidarity is something I'm going to come back to in my comments and reflections. So firstly, there's this labour problem, but there's also this potential issue of who accesses healthcare. Why opening NHS up to competition in service provision kind of raises alarm bells for so many people is this issue of standards, accountability, and also the question as to whether it's going to become a backdoor to privatisation. And I think, again, Silke did this good job of saying, actually, I think that's a little bit of a distraction and kind of shifts our attention away from some of these wider questions that are vital. But when people talk about privatisation, particularly in regard to gender concerns, I think one of the big things that comes up is this idea of a slow creep of user fees. User fees are really popular among liberal health economists, particularly working in international development agencies such as the World Bank. And they tend to be then universally hated by everyone else who works in public health, mainly because they create barriers to how people access healthcare, particularly men who don't use health services as much as women, traditionally in lower middle income countries. If you introduce fees, that's going to increase the barrier towards people accessing healthcare. And it's also around those balancing, what do you pay for in your household income? Do you use that money to go and access health services, or do you use it to prioritise other needs? So why this kind of opening up to competition is a concern is, will that lead to a slow creep of user fees from either paying for food when you're in a hospital or actually using at the point of access, which we know is coming in different aspects of the NHS for other people, for people who use it at the point of access. Finally, the point that I think is really important why we're talking about this today is us feminists in global health have this kind of saying that global health is led by men and delivered by women. And it applies here. Trade deals affecting the NHS are negotiated predominantly by men and have implications for a system that depends on and is run by women. Men negotiating these trade deals don't necessarily have experience or knowledge of what it takes to run a health system. And often, sometimes, I don't really think they're necessarily experts in trade policy either. So we have a dual problem there. So men are determining the future of the NHS, and it's women who are going to have to deal with the consequences. However, this does not mean that women are completely voiceless on trade issues that affect their health. And a key area of this has historically been around intellectual property. So intellectual property, for me, has always been a feminist issue and will grow as one. So the briefing gives a really handy overview of the World Trade Organization's TRIPS waiver, so trade-related intellectual property rights, on COVID vaccines, and the MEH agreement, that's my technical professorial term, that was reached earlier this month on the waiver. This waiver is important because it will reduce the cost of vaccines and free up other countries to produce vaccines that are under patent. But what's really important, I think, for our discussion is the history of where this waiver came from in the first place. You can trace the origins of a TRIPS waiver, i.e., in a time of exceptional health emergencies, you waiver intellectual property, back to the activism of South African women demanding access to treatment to prevent the transmission of HIV to their unborn children at the end of the 1990s and early 2000s. At this point, women knew that access to affordable treatment and services was essential to the right to health, and this was being stopped by intellectual property. And why this is important in contemporary trade policies and understanding these kind of intellectual property deals is we see this activism going forward now around COVID-19. So the People's Vaccine Alliance is really being led by women who cut their teeth on AIDS activism and have learned from the history of AIDS activism in how we challenge intellectual property. They know that intellectual property is a feminist issue because should the world not get vaccinated against COVID-19, who deals with the people who get sick? Women. Who is responsible for doing the graft work of getting vaccines into the arms of others? Women, in terms of immunisation teams, fighting vaccine hesitancy within their friends and families and wider communities. And it's also a feminist issue because of feminist solidarity. I mean, we all want to forget about COVID-19. We all want to put it in the past, even though everyone I know seems to have got it in the last week. But not everyone can. I mean, it's a different experience for us having COVID-19 to somebody who doesn't have access to a vaccine. Therefore, feminist activism on intellectual property, it already exists. And there is a legacy there in which I think we can build on and do so in a really productive way. Finally, looking at the future of intellectual property, I think we really need to keep an eye on the price of medicine for particular women's health. So we know that women's health has traditionally been undervalued and under-researched, and sort of fabulous work by activists such as Caroline Criado-Perez has really put that into the public spotlight, and there is now efforts to redress this. But with redress comes new drugs. hurrah, this is a good news, we want new drugs, but at high prices. If there are new drugs, they're going to be under patent. So we really need to have a kind of an accountability system that monitors which new drugs have been subsidized by public funds and watch the pricing around that. And we should use this as a wider push to actually reform some of the kind of regulations on intellectual property for essential and life-saving methods. So finally, I have 1 minute, so I'm going to speed through this super quick. Thanks, Marianne. I really want to thank Silke for showcasing the impact of FTAs on food. So food is life and death. Trade policies affect the price of food and the food we eat. Malnutrition, referring to the dual burden of being overweight and underweight, particularly in lower middle income countries, is one of the leading causes of morbidity and mortality of women. Now, malnutrition is complex, and here I would really highlight the fantastic work of Jennifer Clapp on food politics, if you're interested. But it's caused by a combination of war, trade, and trade-related concerns such as agricultural policy and climate change. Of course, it was exacerbated by COVID-19, where in 2020, an extra 320 million people went hungry. That's extra. You know, when you read it to everybody, you're like, this is insane. Bring the total to 811 people malnourished in the world. Now, where does this relate to women? Crucially, for every 10 food insecure men, there are 11 food insecure women in the world. And why? Well, I think the answer is obvious. It doesn't matter if you're in Bujumbura or Birmingham. When resources are scarce, women go hungry and feed their families first. Women don't necessarily have control of household budget. I think this is an assumption that we make in general. They are, but not all the time, and not all the time can access food. And food budgets can be squeezed by competing concerns. So a new school uniform, medical bills, displacement can cut a bit the ability to eat, and of course, what you eat. So again, malnutrition is not just about being undernourished, it's about what you eat and overnourishment. So this brings us back to the briefing. So when I sort of say this, people say, but isn't this just poor countries? You know, we're looking at women's budget group in the UK, what's going on here? Well, predominantly, yes. But the cost of living and austerity also highlight the huge problem there is around food scarcity and malnutrition here in the UK. And as the briefing shows, FTAs will impact on the price of food and the kind of food we eat. What is universal is women are likely to be more now malnourished than men, and this has massive impacts on their health, and are somehow having to adapt to global economic changes in trade, climate change, and conflict. So you have this impossible individualizing of global economic problems. So to wrap up very quickly, what are we going to do about all this? Firstly, demystify trade policy. And this is why this briefing is so fantastic. Let's get into the weeds and let's just demystify it. Build on the legacies of people interested in intellectual property and trade, and ask these key questions. Never ask an MP if they intend to sell off the NHS. They're always going to say no. Ask the technical questions that Silke introduced us to. And finally, this relationship is not just about women in the UK, it's global. So we have to build global solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. That was fabulous and really, brought to life particularly the connections, I think, between women in the UK and women in other parts of the world, and we can hopefully talk more about that in the questions. So finally, I would like to hand over to Anum Qaisar MP from the SNP, who's going to talk from the SNP's perspective about their international trade policy position.
Thank you so much, Marianne, and it's a pleasure to follow on from Silke and Sophie. I was particularly struck by the briefing paper which I have next to me here. It really is an essential inquiry. Well done to the team and to the Women's Budget Group. And if there's anything I can do from a parliamentary perspective to showcase it more, please do let me know. The paper, of course, comes at an important time as the UK continues to push through its negotiating trade deals following Brexit. And the paper, of course, highlights the important but often forgotten link between trade policy, feminism and public health. As I said in my introduction, my name's Anum Qaisar and I'm the SNP MP for Adrian Shott. I was elected in a by-election last year. I'm the second youngest MP. I'm one of the few female MPs we have in Scotland, and I'm the only MP in Scotland who is not white. I also sit on the Women and Equalities Committee, and I am the SNP's Deputy International Trade Spokesperson at Westminster. And so a large part of my focus, coupled with my spokesperson role and my committee role, is developing a gender-just trade policy in line with my party, the SNP's commitment to developing a feminist foreign policy. And this, of course, is particularly important considering the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, made a statement yesterday on the announcement of holding a second independence referendum next year in October. And on the matter of independence, what we see for Scotland is pushing forward a gender-just trade policy that can be used as a positive social tool for women and girls globally. Because, of course, issues of gender-just trade and feminist foreign policy complements global public health. And I'm very proud to be part of the SNP, and independence for me is a way in which we can create a Scotland that empowers communities and empowers women to participate fully in society. And to get sidetracked a little bit, with the limited powers that Scotland has, we see that the SNP Scottish Government are attempting to bring forward legislation that puts women at the heart of policy decisions, specifically from a healthcare perspective. So Scots, for example, made period products free. So we were first in the world to do so, and by challenging stigmas around menstruation cycles and having these conversations, I really am excited to see what else we can do as a party and potentially an independent Scotland. Because, of course, for far too long, policy has been created by and for middle-aged, privileged white men. So the UK's current approach to negotiating trade deals is lacking, to say the least. It's narrow in focus and fails to prevent gendered social inequalities from being perpetuated. So in the area of healthcare, the UK government has moved away from the protections that existed within EU trade deals, following an agenda that seeks to liberalise trade, like putting services like the NHS and social care at risk. Prior to sitting on Women and Equalities Committee, I sat on Health and Social Care Committee, and I saw this dismantling of the NHS in front of my eyes. And of course, we know when it comes to dismantling organisations like the NHS, there's key groups that are always going to be left behind, and those usually are women and other minority groups. So I recently wrote an article in the Red Box Times, and I'll be happy to share this afterwards if you so wish. And in my piece, I examined the legislative measures that can take place to empower women. So in Scotland, for example, the SNP government have increased childcare. And this has a significant impact on women because we know that childcare so often disproportionately impacts women. But back on trade, so trade policy affects everyone in all areas of life, be it as consumers, producers, workers, users of public services and providers of unpaid care work. But too often, trade policies are poorly designed, with policies aimed at privileging wealthy countries and corporations, and this has a deeply harmful effect on women. And women work in industries more often than not that are easily exploited by trade deals. They usually work in informal sectors of the economy, such as manufacturing and production, and they contribute 76% of the world's unpaid care work. And despite compromising almost half of the world's agricultural workforce, women own less than 20% of the land. So we have entrenched patriarchal norms and prejudice, which often dictate women and girls' level of social, economic and political engagement in any society. And so with fewer opportunities across the globe, women tend to be heavily concentrated in poorer paid jobs with fewer protections and safeguards. And this has the potential for them to be exploited within trade deals. And so it is vitally important that we do more to ensure that we push the UK government to develop a trade policy that takes gender-just trade seriously. And this is something that I've raised in the chamber previously. However, when we do this, we must ensure that, sorry, I lost my train of thought. When we do so, it should not be a focus on ensuring that women, particularly those in the global south, are merely integrated in the system, because that, of course, risks perpetuating existing social and economic inequalities. The current approach that we have from the UK government, in my view, is narrow. It focuses solely on trying to integrate largely middle-class white women into a system that already exacerbates gender inequality, rather than putting pressure on international system to radically overhaul its policies. So a new focus must be placed on formulating a clear trade policies that prioritises gender equality, safeguards and human rights obligations. And it's not just about getting more women around the patriarchal table, it's about smashing up that table and building it afresh with greater inclusion and involvement of women and other marginalised groups. By adopting a new gender just trade policy and approach, we can adapt a policy which can be used to bring positive social justice for women and girls globally. The World Bank recently declared that only 6 countries in the world granted equal legal working rights to women as men. The UK is not one of these countries. And the way that we negotiate trade deals can help to increase legal working rights and protections in all fields, including global health. And so to achieve this, we must ensure that we change the way in which trade negotiations are conducted. So there's too much focus currently on ensuring that the economic impact of a trade deal is assessed. Trade deals need to reframe their point of assessment to consider the impact that any deal will have on gender-specific issues. A new independent statutory body could play a large part in this by conducting gender just trade impact assessments. So women's rights and gender equality groups and experts must be included at all stages of the process and play an active role in delegations and negotiations. In my capacity as Deputy International Trade Spokesperson, I have raised lists in the Chamber. It may come as a surprise, or it may not come as a surprise, that we've not really had any commitment from the UK government on this. And so that's something that I'm going to continue to push. During the negotiation of trade deals, checks must happen at all stages of the negotiations to ensure compliance with gender policies. And these gender policies must have explicit chapters within the trade deals outlining provisions designed to promote gender equality. So by reframing the policies negotiated in trade deals, we can move away from deals which seek to liberalise public services, particularly healthcare. When healthcare is liberalised in trade deals, it pushes individuals away from using it due to rising costs. And as the burden of caring often falls on women, such trade deals may only increase women's caring responsibilities as people become priced out of healthcare. Thank you so much once again for inviting me along to speak. My commitment is that I'll continue to stand up in the House of Commons chamber and call on the UK government to ensure that their trade deals are gender trust. I sit here in this Zoom call and genuinely extend a hand of friendship. If there's anything that I can do, please do let me know. And I sincerely hope that in the not too distant future, I can welcome you to an independent Scotland where we put women at the heart of our trade deals and healthcare policies.
Thank you very much. And it's great to hear that commitment to keep raising those issues in Westminster. And I know we're setting up, I think we're trying to set up a meeting for you and others with Silke to go through some of the questions that that need to be raised. So hopefully we will start seeing those questions being raised and answered. That's great. So just a reminder to everyone in the audience to put your questions in the chat box. We've already got one, which I will read, which is from Donatella Alessandri. saying, thank you very much for your contributions and many congratulations to Silke and the Women's Budget Group for this great briefing. I wonder if Silke could expand on the much favoured nation implications of the negative list approach of these deals, and on whether there are mechanisms for reversing obligations if there is adverse impact. Are equality impact assessments built in at all? And finally, a question for all about the kind of alliances that you think are necessary transnationally to keep pressure on governments, particularly at a time when most trade policies are framed in nationalistic terms. So that's a question to start with Silke and then to the rest of the panel. Silke, when you're answering, can you explain a little bit about what most favoured nation means? Because not everybody might understand that.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. And I meant to cover it in my talk, but I was going way over. So MFN is one of the key concepts of trade policy, really. It refers to most favored nation. It exists in the WTO. And in the WTO, it essentially means that any member, whatever is the most favorable treatment it gives to any trading partner, it automatically has to extend to all WTO members. It's a classic non-discrimination provision. Now, it's creeping up in FTAs. FTAs are by definition not MFN, right? FTAs by definition say, I have very favorable treatment with Australia in the FTA, and I don't give that to anyone else. So this new type of provision has started appearing, and we've seen it for a number of decades now. It's not new, but it's newish. And it's called, whether that's helpful or not, it's called third-party MFN. And what it means basically is to say that, so let's just say the UK-Australia deal, it's always good to explain with an example. The UK-Australia deal has a third-party MFN clause in the services chapter. What that means is that should the UK or Australia go ahead and in the future negotiate more generous market access with another country, this will automatically then apply in the relationship between the UK and Australia. So let's say the UK goes ahead and gives more wide-reaching market access to healthcare providers in the US deal. And this will automatically also extend to the Australian providers because of the third-party MFN clause. And so again, the worry is that you sort of putting in liberalization commitments where you don't know what you're committing to because you don't know what's going to be in the future agreement, right? So this is a similar concern with the negative list approach. The concern is really that because you're automatically liberalizing everything that hasn't been listed, things may change in the future and service sectors may appear that weren't foreseeable at the time of the agreement being negotiated. For example, in the online and digital realm, and then it's automatically liberalized, right? So this is where the second question is really important, which is around reversing obligations. So I mean, reversing obligations. So usually what you can do if you're not happy with a trade deal or some of the commitments, you can try and renegotiate. There's always the possibility. Usually though, the other party is going to want something in return because that's how trade negotiations work. It's very rare that anybody renegotiates anything because it's going to come at a cost, right? The other option is simply don't apply the trade agreement. At the end of the day, it's international law. And if you don't apply it, you then need to kind of consider what are going to be the consequences of this, right? We've seen this in the trade realm quite prominently, and this ties into our conversation with the hormones case. If you recall, the EU doesn't import any hormone-traded beef from the US and Canada, and they lost the case in the WTO, but they simply never complied. And then there was a kind of compensation mechanism, so where the US and Canada were raising trade barriers to offset the economic damage, and the EU just kind of agreed to paying it, and that was it. So in a way, it's international law and it's a political diplomatic arena, and if you don't want to apply it, you don't apply it, right? But again, there might be a cost associated. And also, I do think it's important that we shouldn't advise the government in any policy area to enter into international legal obligations and then simply not follow through on these obligations. I mean, that's just not very good policy advice by any standard. So really really, the best thing is to get your obligations right at the point of negotiating the agreement. And this is the importance of consulting far and wide with policymakers from all policy areas that are affected, because it's so important to get it right, because afterwards it's going to be expensive to change it. Now, very briefly on impact assessment, I think there was a question. So yes, impact assessments are taking place, and I do know that the Department for International Trade also aim to conduct gender-based impact assessment, but I think that they can be way more far-reaching. So from what I have seen, and anybody who knows that I'm wrong, please correct me, but from what I have seen, the gender-based impact assessment that is being conducted at the moment focuses on different sectors of the economy that are being liberalized and women's employment. But as we've been arguing, all of us, is trade is about so much more than employment. So the impact assessment needs to be a lot broader. Thank you.
I mean, I think that's fairly true, isn't it, of government impact assessments more generally, that there's a real failure to recognise what equality impact actually means. So they'll pick on one thing that can be easily measured, and they'll say, oh, well, this sector employs a lot of women and this sector doesn't employ a lot of women, and that's our impact assessment. And that's about as far as it goes. So there was another question to other members of the panel about the sorts of alliances that are needed to keep pressure on governments. I mean, this can either be nationally or internationally. How do we push back against this sort of creeping process of liberalisation within trade agreements, and how do we push for an approach to trade that actually centres people and their needs, and in this context, particularly women's health needs? Sophie, I don't know if you want to go first.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's a great question. I think the first one on the global level, I think is building on momentum that already exists. So from the People's Health Movement, People's Vaccine Alliance, Treatment Action Campaign, they have stopped trade policies in their tracks before and prioritised healthcare. So it's building alliances from them, looking at the tactics that they deploy, how they identify sympathetic states, how they work with governments within these negotiations. It's not perfect, but it exists. And I think, I always say this to students: if you say campaigners versus the WTO or the US government, who wins? They always think it's the US government and the WTO. And there have been cases where that's not the case, it's the activists. So it's building those sort of alliances. And the other point is actually at the domestic level, these sorts of forums and the kind of collaborations between civil society, academics, researchers and politicians. So it's not only just doing these impact assessments, which also not only is there that kind of low-hanging fruits kind of aspect that Marianne you were talking about, but also this kind of they just go on the shelf and get dusty. It's the broken record idea of Silke working with Anum saying, like, this is what's coming up, this is what we need to be asking them, this is how you scrutinise people. This has been really effective in other parts of international policy around kind of weapons, trade in weapons and the arms trade. That's what I was looking for, the arms trade, where MPs often don't know the questions to ask. So researchers have actually just worked with them to say, these are the very specific questions you need to be asking. And I think working like that actually gives an additional layer of scrutiny, which is why I think this forum, the work of the Women's Budget Group, is so important. We just need to keep talking to each other about this and doing that kind of broken record stuff of just keeping asking those questions.
Thank you very much. Anum, I'm sure you've got lots to say about what can be done kind of inside and outside Parliament on this.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you, Donatella. That was a really great question. I've got a couple of notes of how I want to answer. I'll start by saying I'm a campaigner, so I'm going to look at it through my lens. I think we need to have a really thorough conversation about what is trade and what role do women play in this, because the reality is that we're sitting here as, I mean, I'm not necessarily an expert, but Sophie, Silke and the Women's Budget Group are experts, and I'm elected. And we have these discussions, but when we go out to the ground and chat to people from the street, I'm not convinced they can actually tell us what role women play in international trade policies. So I think, first of all, we have to have a look at it from the ground. So chatting to community groups, organisations, having round tables like this where people can come together and have these conversations. We then have to have a look at it from a legislative perspective. So what can we as MPs do? So as I've said in my contribution earlier, I've spoken in the House of Commons chamber. My wonderful research team of Chloe, Katie and Callum are looking at potentially bringing forward debates in the House of Commons, because this will give MPs an opportunity to discuss and have conversations. And obviously we've got committees in the House of Commons, even though the Secretary of State for International Trade, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, didn't turn up to this morning's session. You've got it from a legislative perspective. You've then got it from a policy perspective, from academics and experts who can come in and have these conversations and teach people like me, as Sophie has said, tell us exactly what it is that we should be asking of the government. As I said in my contribution, I really do think that we need an independent statutory body that can look at conducting gender trust impact assessments, and then following on from this, we should be examining good practice from our European and international partners, just because, and I don't want to become too political, but I come from a country that voted to remain in the EU. We were dragged out, but that does not mean that the UK still cannot look at good practice from the EU partners and international partners, see what they're doing to ensure that women are included in international trade policies. I hope that answers your question, Donatella.
I think that's great. You said thank you very much for all your answers. We haven't had any other questions in the chat. I mean, one of the things I wanted to ask really is about, and it's following on the point that Anum made about communication, and because what you've got is something that people think of as very, very complicated and therefore not for them. And on the one hand, we're trying to argue, actually, there's some really big, important things here and you ought to pay attention to them. On the other hand, when you're looking at the potential implications of trade agreements, a lot of it does become quite detailed and technical, and some of the things that Silke was pointing out about, necessary for rather than related to, and that sort of thing, which does require a degree of kind of technical expertise and ability to go through incredibly long documents with a fine-tooth comb. So how do we kind of balance that, communicating in a way that makes sense to people while recognizing that's some international trade law stuff is actually, it is complicated. Anum, you had your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to ask if I can go first, please. I've got a meeting.
Please do.
I need to run off to.
Yes.
No, I think it's a really, really important point, Marianne. When I was given the spokesperson role back in December, January, one of the first conversations I had with my team is international trade. That's not for someone like me. And they turned around and went, well, why not? And so I think, well, there's two parts. We've got entrenched prejudices that we have, that we see people talking about international trade, it's usually just men. And that's something that we really have to tackle. And I will say quite publicly, as a woman, when I first was given this spokesperson role, I was fearful because I wasn't sure if I'd understand much of it. And that then follows on to my second point of the language that we use around international trade. I think, and this comes down to a House of Commons issue, so often in Parliament, from a legislative perspective, we use language that we do not use in ordinary day-to-day life. And to me, there's a deeper issue there, where that is purposely done to ensure that politics and legislative issues are seen as only to be done by the elites, and it ensures that a section of society do not engage with it. I think we really need to have a firm conversation about the language we use around international trade. And I'll be quite honest, it's something that I've had to learn myself. I was a teacher of politics prior to my election. I didn't have much expertise in that. And that's something that I've been trying to do in my role. Thank you, and I'm so sorry, I am going to have to leave. I've got a meeting.
No, thank you very much, and thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it, and we'll look forward to carrying on the conversation.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. So before we wrap up, Sophie and Silke, I don't know if you've got anything to add on that thing about how do you make things accessible while at the same time recognising the complexities.
No, I think, I mean, ultimately it's going to come down to alliances, right? You're going to need people who have the experiences on the ground, or groups that represent them, and you have to put them in contact with lawyers who can say, change that word to, you're going to need to have that kind of exchange. And that's actually, at the end of the day, is sort of good lawmaking, isn't it? Is that there is a conversation between the people who are affected and the people who kind of try and get the regulations right. Of course, trade is a highly technical area, and that has a depoliticizing effect. That's clear. So to repoliticize it, we just need to do that work. There's no other way, right? There's no armchair politicizing. It doesn't exist. And one thing that I want to say about language is that very often, and I see this in the classroom, and of course in kind of speeches that we read about it, we still present it with a scenario whereby trade policy is a choice between free trade and protectionism. And the reality now is completely different. This is just an oversimplification that doesn't help the debate. All trade agreements across the world have elements that allow for more trade flows and elements that kind of regulate and control them. And one thing that I think would be really helpful is if we just acknowledge trade is always managed in some way, shape or form by international agreements and government legislation. And so let's talk about how we need to manage it, rather than being stuck with this 19th century debate that isn't applicable in today's world.
I think that's a really good point. I don't know, you might have been at the same round table as me with Department for International Trade, where I kind of raised a question, and I actually said, you know, trade had positive and negative impacts on women. And the minister there went straight into trade as, you know, personally, I think trade is a really good thing, you know, and like there was no sense that you could say, well, yeah, there's some positive impacts and there's some negative impacts, and how do we deal with it? It was like, you know, trade, it's either great or terrible, and there's no sort of space in between. Sophie, have you got anything to add?
Yeah, it's really simple. Just make it relatable. So I don't think we need to have to tell people what a dispute settlement mechanism is, but we say, you know, your local authority can't change its bin contracts because of this. That makes it relatable. How much are your medicines? Why can't you afford them? And actually, I'm going to disagree with Silke. I think overstressing the complexity of this actually helps switch people off. Let's not treat people like idiots. Let's make, not that Silke is, I should add. Let's just take it a relatable concept and then broaden it out to why this matters. That is kind of coming back to Anum's point. Let's start from the ground up. What issues affect people's lives? Then let's explain why that is.
That's brilliant. That's a really good point to finish on. So thank you very much to all our panelists. Thank you to the audience for coming. Thank you to Elle and Georgia from the Women's Budget Group for all the work that they've done to organise the event. And as I said, we will put the video up on our website, and we will be sending that and a copy of the briefing to everybody who's registered to attend. And we are following up with parliamentarians as we speak. So expect a number of emails from us, Silke, going, oh, could you come and speak to these people? Could you go and speak to those people? Hopefully. Let's see. Anyway, great to be with you.
Thank you again, if I can.
And so, thank you all very much. Bye-bye.